Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our first ZFA Conversation for 2024. Before I start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. Our guest tonight is Peter Lerner. Peter is a Lieutenant Colonel Reserve currently serving in the IDF Spokesperson's unit. He spent a long career in the IDF, including in the Spokesperson's unit, and in 2014, Newsweek called Peter's job, quote, the worst media job in the world because of how he had to present Israel's story to a constantly skeptical media. The same article, I should point out, also said that Peter brought to the role a, quote, breath of fresh air, clarity and professionalism. Now, until October last year, Peter had left the army and was the Director General of International Relations of the Histadrut, which is the Central Israeli Trade Union. And in that role, Peter was responsible for all of the Histadrut's worldwide activities, including establishing, enhancing, and intensifying the union's global reach, mutual learning, and international solidarity activities with the challenges of the labor movement of our time. And it was in that role that I last met Peter. He was in Australia for an international trade union conference, and we had lunch together. We didn't really discuss trade union stuff, just Israel and politics and conflict and more. And it was an absolutely fascinating hour or so, which is why I have no doubt that Peter is the perfect person to discuss the current situation with you. Now, we all know what happened on 7th of October, and we all know what's been happening since. Peter was called up out of civilian life and is back serving in the IDF Spokesperson's unit. And it is in that capacity that he'll be filling us in on what's going on. Speaking to Peter tonight is Alon Cassuto, who might be a new face to some of you. Alon is the ZFA CEO, having replaced the retiring Jeanette Searle at the beginning of this year. Now, just before I hand you over to Alon, let me just remind you that if you have any questions, click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Alon.
Thank you very much, Bren, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great honor and privilege to be hosting my first ZFA conversation with none other than Peter Lerner. The ZFA's mission is to build a thriving Jewish community in Australia that's deeply connected to Israel. And we do this in a range of different ways around our three key pillars, which are leadership, advocacy, and connection. And as many of you know, over the past 6 months, we've been working quite tirelessly for our community and for the state of Israel. And I do want to thank our amazing team at the ZFA, our sponsors, our supporters, and obviously our beloved community who we do this for, because we couldn't do it without you. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to have my very first ZFA conversation with someone I've admired for a very long time. Peter's become really the voice of Israel, the voice of the IDF in foreign media and around the world. He's one of our finest advocates. He's one of our greatest communicators. He's a leader, he's a soldier. And Peter, we have so much to discuss, and we really thank you for spending an hour of your time with us when we know your time is so precious. Before we dive deep into the conflict, because I know it is the topic of tonight's conversation and on everyone's minds, you aren't a typical Israeli. You've had a very fascinating career to land where you are today. And I'd love to hear just your story of how it is that you've found yourself as one of the top spokespeople in the IDF.
Thanks, Alon. Thanks, Brent, for the warm welcome. Where should I start? I think it was very, very clear from the outset when I was a boy at a very young age, when my family made Aliyah to Israel, that I was going to be a soldier. But I've always had asthma, so I was not going to be a combat soldier. And my mum always made sure that I had a book in my hand. And I was never one to be, I think, too quiet. I was always speaking. And I think words and meaningful words were always part of me. And so when I joined the army in 92, when I was recruited, the IDF, probably a bit by mistake, actually placed me in the right place. I got a placement as a non-commissioned officer engaging and communicating with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Those were my baby steps in the world of, I would say, diplomacy, public diplomacy, communications. And indeed, that for me was very, very, it was empowering as a young person, but it was also very, very much of my essence of being a bridge between Israel, the IDF, the defense establishment, and the world, whether it be international organizations, diplomatic missions, or in a later stage, the world media as well. I think so I think basically it was in my destiny to be in this this type of role. I didn't know that I would actually end up as a spokesperson for the IDF until much, much later. But I think there was always that role or perception of aspiring to be a bridge. I think a lot of our problems in Israel can be solved or at least mitigated with good communications. I think a lot of what Israelis think and say gets conveyed in a very, very Israeli way that doesn't necessarily get understood in a broader context of the world. And I think that is where my communication skills help to mitigate some of the differences, try and iron out some of those challenges. So that's my professional career. My master's is in conflict resolution and negotiation. So it's also found my way into the academia side of it. My bachelor's is in strategy and social sciences. So it was basically it all fit into my life path. I am married and we have one daughter. When I retired from the military, all I wanted to do was be a full-time dad. Noya was then 6 years old, just going into first grade. That's all I wanted to do. And 2 years later, the Histadrut, the Federation of Labor in Israel, recruited me to be the head of the International Relations Department, which for me was again along the same lines of wanting to be in the crossroads between Israel and the world. In this case, Israel's workers and the workers of the world. The only thing when I told my daughter that I was going to go back to work, or she said, "But Daddy, who will take me to school in the morning?" And I said, "Noya, as long as you want me to take you to school, I will be there to take you to school as long as I'm in the country." And this morning I actually took her to school again. So she's now 12 years old, but she's celebrating her bat mitzvah year. So it was a very, very interesting 5 years. But and now to bring us just to where we are today, 7 years ago when I retired from the military, I had no intention of being in uniform again. I've been critical of the military, I would say critical of the government as well over the course of these years. I've written essays and opinion pieces in the media about IDF conduct and where we can be. In the course of those 7 years of being in my retirement, the IDF has called me in for probably 1.5 days of reserve duty. When I woke up on the 7th, I didn't wake up on the 7th of October. I was lying in bed. I was jet lagged. We got back from a family vacation in Florida. And I was sitting there in my bed, scrolling on social media on my mobile phone. And at 6:30, the sirens on my mobile app started to sound out. It woke my wife up, who for some reason wasn't jet lagged. And she said, "What's going on?" I said, "The sirens are sounding down south." As I said down south, the sirens started to sound in my town in Ramat Gan, which is just east of Tel Aviv. So we got up out of bed. We woke up my 12-year-old who wasn't happy about being woken up because of the sirens. We went down to the shelter, but I was watching things that develop on social media as they were very, 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 very clear that something extreme and unprecedented was happening. We waited the 10 minutes that we were supposed to wait while sirens sounding in our shelter. And when we came back up, it was all over the national media. My wife, Liat, looked at me. She said, Peter, they're coming for us too. And so from my perspective, that was a very, very clear call for having to do something. So I was watching it on social media as it was developing. I think the first thing I did was sat down and write an opinion piece in the Jerusalem Post about the failures of the IDF on that day. And the second thing I did was reach out to the unit and say, if you need me, I will come. And they said, we'll wait until something, when it really gets serious, then we'll call you up, which is basically code name for don't call us, we'll call you. And the next day they said, please come in tomorrow. So I've been now 133 days in uniform. I could not imagine being or doing anything else.
So Peter, I think we all remember vividly where we were when we first heard about what was unfolding on October 7th. And as you were reliving your moments, I feel like all 230 people who've logged in from across Australia were probably reliving their own experiences. I remember personally being just glued to the media, the news, trying to get every little piece of information I could and frantically texting all my loved ones, family, friends in Israel. And the initial shock then obviously evolved. It became something else. We started to see the complexity unfold, and now we fast forward, it's 135 days since that 7th of October. And as you said, one of your biggest missions and challenges is to iron out that complexity and help us make sense of it. And I'm sure everyone who's logged on is reading, consuming so much different information. From your perspective, where are we at with the conflict? Where are things at the moment? And what's evolving as we're here tonight?
So Alon, we have to go back to the 7th of October to realize where we are and how we got here, where we are currently, and perhaps where we're going. I think the biggest difference that this war has been identified with compared to all of the other conflicts we've had with Hamas or with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad since 2008 is the stated military goal, the instructions that we've been given by the government, which are twofold. First of all, to dismantle and destroy Hamas. And I put the emphasis as a governing authority and a terrorist entity. We have no intention of eradicating the ideology of Hamas. That's not a military goal. This goal has never been given to the IDF before. And that basically translates into the military, the war effort that is currently undergoing. The second goal, of course, is to bring back the hostages, because Israel has never in the history of the country experienced a reality where, and you all know that we've had a history of wars, a history of terrorist attacks. But in one day, in all of our wars, the home front, the civilians of Israel, were not the target. On the 7th of October, the civilians of Israel were the clear target. And that for us is two very, very distinct differences. The war goal of dismantling, destroying Hamas as a governing authority. And I will weigh on what that actually means on one hand, but also on the other hand, bringing home the hostages, every last one of them. And I'll weigh on both of those things, how we do it. So as we roll back and look over the last 4.5 months, we need to understand, and I will just share one slide with you just to show how the motions of the war began. And if we go back to the 7th of October, we had on that day around 3,000 terrorists infiltrate into Israel. An attack on the magnitudes that Israel had never experienced. An attack, and I did see in the Q&A a question about how did this happen? Where were the IDF? The IDF did not have the strategic understanding or the tactical intelligence to be prepared for such an attack. This will have to be investigated as to why we did not have the full picture, but this is the reality. And on the 7th of October, as Hamas terrorists breached the border along the fence, overcame the border over the fence with paragliders, and circumvented the fence through fast boats at sea, the IDF was caught in a strategic surprise, a tactical surprise, and an operational surprise. The attack that took place, we were still finding terrorists in Israeli territory 2 weeks into the attack. So if it happened on the 7th of October, 2 weeks later, we were still picking up terrorists in Israeli territory. So the initial goal for the activity, for the war effort, was to retake the perimeter area, the border area of the Israeli side of the border, and at the same time conduct airstrikes against strategic locations in order to mitigate the ability of Hamas to launch rockets at Israel and drones at Israel, and perhaps a second wave of attacks against Israel. So retaking the perimeter area, the border area, has two efforts in it. First of all, evacuating the remaining civilians, those that were not abducted or killed in the massacre of the 7th of October. So mass evacuation, around 100 or 80,000 people evacuated from that area. But also regaining control of the perimeter itself, the border area itself, because they breached the perimeter in some 30 different locations. And so either taking control of the perimeter or utilizing the perimeter area to conduct limited ground operations, which began on the 26th of October as ground raids in the perimeter area, which had two goals in itself: to pick up bodies that Hamas had dropped on the way back, which is devastating just to say it out loud, and to engage the enemy where they'd pre-positioned anti-tank squads, booby traps, things that could prevent our ground operations as they develop. If we understand that the IDF's instructions that we'd received from the government are to dismantle and destroy Hamas as a governing authority, that in itself means that there is going to be a vast, wide ground operation. We did it for around a month, and the ground operations were, in the initial stages, were focused primarily in the northern Gaza area and the northern Gaza Strip. And in order to conduct the ground operations there, we needed to conduct a mass evacuation, a temporary evacuation of civilians to get them out of harm's way. We instructed people to go south of the Wadi Gaza, which is where this blue line is today. And that created an opportunity for immense pressure on Hamas. That created the opportunity to create an operational pause, known as a ceasefire, to create a hostage release. The hostage release, basically, we brought home 110 hostages throughout negotiations, through diplomacy, which was nerve-wracking here in Israel. Every night, people were glued to their television sets, very, very much concerned about who would be released, who were the people, who were the women, who were the children who was coming home, and more concerning who was not coming home. This lasted for 7 days, and on day 7, on the 1st of December, Hamas was supposed to announce at 7 a.m. here in Israel who was going to be released on that day. At 6 a.m., instead of waiting till 7, they started launching rockets at Israel. So we understood that they had decided to resume the operations, and therefore we conducted our operations. And from then, we branched further deeper into the Gaza Strip from the areas in the north to include the areas in the south, the Khan Yunis area, which is the second stronghold, second hub of control of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, primarily because it's the birthplace of Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the massacre, the prime minister of Hamas in Gaza, Mohammed Deif. That is where they feel most at home. And so we knew we would have to conduct a substantial operation down there. And throughout the course of the war effort, we've conducted extensive operations, both in the north and in the south, in the area of Khan Yunis, in order to pursue Hamas, dismantle and destroy their capabilities. And now we are in a position where I can imagine that a lot of you are asking, what's going to happen with Rafah? What is going to happen? Where are we going to move forward? I think what's important to note at this stage is that we've killed some 10,000 Hamas terrorists in this war so far, which is about 1/3 of their power. We've killed in action brigade commanders, 2 brigade commanders, around 19 battalion commanders of Hamas, dismantling and destroying most of Hamas's battalions, which means they can't organize as a military force in the way that they did on the 7th of October. It means that they're also evolving into a more like guerrilla warfare phenomena. That for us is a challenge, but not the most substantial challenge. The characteristics of combat, or challenges of the combat that the IDF is facing on the ground, is a 360-degree threat based on and utilized by the tunnel network that Hamas have built over the last 16 years. The tunnel network is the most expensive, expansive, vast construction project ever to exist in the Gaza Strip. Not for the benefit of the people of Gaza, but for, I would say, to the detriment of them, because what they've ultimately done is positioned all of their assets beneath ground, beneath the people, the civilians of Gaza, using the people of Gaza as their iron dome, and that creates a huge, huge challenge. Of course, it gives them some operational opportunities, not necessarily advantages, but it means that they can come out of a tunnel, conduct an attack, whether through anti-tank guided missiles, RPGs, drones, sniper fire, and then disappear beneath ground. They are operating in an area which they are very, very familiar with. There is extensive booby traps, improvised explosive devices that they can try and attach to our armored vehicles. And of course, all of these combined together, when you conduct ground operation in a partially destroyed urban environment, also in itself raises a challenge. In order to address those challenges, we based, I would say, 4 operational principles that allow us to operate. First of all, because of the 360-degree threat, we have conducted our operations based on a careful, accurate, and a straightforward planning process. So the Gaza Strip is a relatively small area. We could storm in quite easily, but it took us several weeks to reach Gaza City. But that's because we were moving slowly, cautiously, securing our rear, a slow and secure maneuver with defensive efforts that support the forces in order to not jeopardize our forces and expose ourselves to unnecessary threats. All of this was conducted with extensive combat engineering work and also under the cover of a substantial aerial support. Those are the characteristics of the combat that we faced on the ground. And each different location, whether it's in the north and the south, has different characteristics specifically. And we are adapting our operations on the ground in order to do those activities.
So,
We understand. Yeah, I was just going to finish on one point and then I'll hand it back to you. We understand that the humanitarian effort is a strategic enabler. So throughout the course of this war, the issue of the humanitarian effort has been, since day one, a part of our operational planning. So whether it's maintaining crossings for humanitarian access, whether it is tactical pauses in specific locations, whether it's the establishment of a humanitarian zone in the south, and facilitating evacuation routes, whether it's maintaining an ongoing medical effort, all of these combined create an operational understanding that they go hand in hand, not without challenge. And none of it is easy. Of course, we are very concerned that goods that go into Gaza will reach Hamas. We don't want to prolong the war any more than is actually needed. And giving Hamas supplies could do that. For instance, in order to exist beneath ground, Hamas need fuel to generate power for ventilation beneath ground. So if they are taking or siphoning off fuel that is supposed to support generators for hospitals, so they're first of all, they're taking from the humanitarian needs of the population, and they're empowering their war effort, which jeopardizes us. That's it. That was very brief opening of where we are.
It's a wonderful overview of a very complex dynamic, and I think the way you've methodically kind of set out what's happened over the past few weeks is really helpful. I'm curious, what has surprised Israel and the IDF? What was unexpected when you got in there and on the ground? I mean, you spoke of the depth of the tunnels and the length of the tunnels and the amount of infrastructure that's been poured into the underground network. But I suppose what's not obvious from outside of Gaza that you only truly appreciate when you are in there?
So I can't say that anything of real substance has been a strategic surprise in the vastness of their capabilities. Of course, because we knew basically what they had beforehand. Of course, we don't have a full map of all of the tunnel network, but our goal isn't to destroy all of the tunnel network. It's to take out the strategic pieces of that puzzle so that they can't be an operational advantage. And when we see huge tunnels that have the capability you can drive cars through, where they've transferred them into holding cells, dungeons beneath ground to hold hostages, where we find beneath the UNRWA headquarters, the UN Health Relief and Works Organization in Gaza, the biggest UN organization in Gaza, when beneath their headquarters, they place their data center, which gives them intelligence capabilities, quite advanced intelligence capabilities, mind you. They strategically placed it beneath the UN because they were concerned that if we found out about it, then we would strike it. And how do you prevent a strike against a data center? You put it beneath a UN facility, which is a safe zone and should not be attacked. So I think that what is more surprising is as we're moving forward, taking apart the mechanism, the institutions of the governing capabilities, the terrorist capabilities of Hamas, we are finding more and more intelligence, which gives us a much broader picture. And every day that we're operating, more intelligence is coming in and giving us new targets to seek out and destroy. It's a puzzle where there are pieces missing that are being filled in every day as the war progresses.
So Peter, sorry, I'm just curious about the tunnels. You mentioned that it's not necessarily a strategic objective to destroy all the tunnels. How does the IDF assess the tunnels and what to do with them? And, I know, for instance, just a few days ago, there was the images of Yahya Sinwar and his family going through the tunnels. how do you then assess how to act on some of that intelligence that's emerging and what to do about the various tunnels?
So when I'm talking about strategic parts of the tunnel system, I would perhaps talk about the Shifa Hospital, which was very, very famous. Why did the IDF need to go to Shifa? Shifa was like a junction, a hub of control, of communications capabilities, and instruction and command, a command center. Not the command center that we visualize perhaps when we watch, I don't know, CSI, and we see these flat screen televisions, and it's a very, very, very tech savvy place. This is a terrorist organization. For them to do command and control, they need a communications capability, and they need contact. So Shifa Hospital, what we found was its role in being part of their command and control system was in its flexibility of that role, which means that the commanders, the battalion commanders or brigade commanders of Hamas from Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun in the northern Gaza Strip, they would, for instance, get in an ambulance that would take them to the hospital. From the hospital, they would access a tunnel system that would reach the Palestine Square, which is a core hub of Hamas's governing capabilities. They would meet there with the politicians, with Yahya Sinwar, with Mohammed Def, with other leaders of Hamas's operating system, whether it's issues to do with the defense, the terrorist industry of building weapons and so on, supply chain and these types of things. And after finishing their meeting, they would go through a different tunnel to come out of a different hospital, Rantisi, which was also connected to the same network, come out of at the Rantisi hospital, get back in the ambulance, and go back to their operational base. So this is when you take out the Shifa Hospital, you're taking out a key link for that flexibility to conduct operations. And what we found when we're taking out these pieces of their operations, that the battalions were becoming much more vulnerable because they couldn't operate. Their leadership was in disarray and disconnect from what was happening on the ground. The ability to diminish their operational structure, their organizational structure, was key in our operational success in the battleground. And once you take away that capability, you then destroy the operational capabilities on the ground, such as the ability to launch rockets. You find where the industry of building the rockets is being developed, and then you take away that capability so they can't restock. Then you seek out the tunnel system, the tactical tunnel system, which operates within the areas of what we call combat complexes, which is an elaborate set of places where buildings, houses, residential buildings are connected either through tunnels or joint walls or alleyways, and pre-positioned explosives, RPGs, AK-47s with ammunition, all in different locations. And you have terrorists that are not wearing uniform, that go from place to place. They look very, I would say, innocent, but they go into a building, they have their weapons and sniper rifles, they do their attack, they leave the weapon there, come out of the building, either go into a tunnel, come out at a different location, and they're walking around as civilians. And so what we're doing in the progress as we move forward is taking the assets one by one and preventing Hamas from regrouping, reattacking us, and engaging Israel again. And that is why we're seeing a very, very sharp decline in their ability, for instance, to launch rockets at us, because they're being pursued, they're being killed on the battleground, their ammunition, their stockpiles are being destroyed. And even when they are successful at launching a rocket like they were yesterday from the north, so we have the ability to intercept and engage quickly the terrorists that actually conducted the attack. So it's a combined effort, and this is the evolution of the battlefield as we are seeing it.
It's interesting, Peter, because there were stories, for instance, after the Battle of Mosul, where ISIS combatants and terrorists would just shave off their beards, and suddenly you couldn't distinguish them from the general population. And it sounds like it's a similar dynamic, which is probably underappreciated in the wider media, that the distinction between a Hamas combatant and a civilian is simply whether they're carrying a weapon. There's no other differentiating, distinguishing characteristics. And I'm curious now, if you think of the topic on everyone's minds and what everyone wants to understand and know, and the great concern, obviously, for civilian life is Rafah and what's going to happen next. We know that it's one of the final strongholds of Hamas. We know that as the IDF takes more and more control over the Gaza Strip, we're closer to the prospects of civilians no longer having to die. But then you do have this one enclave, which is really a really difficult battleground, as you said. And I'm just curious, as you start to turn your mind to what does this mean in terms of both the broader conflict and how you need to explain the narrative, but also what the job is to be done within Rafah for the IDF. How do we understand this unfolding dynamic?
So first of all, I would say that every step of the way of this war, every time we've wanted to do something, the world has been telling us it can't be done. We called for a mass evacuation of the northern Gaza Strip. The world, the UN organizations were saying it can't be done. It was done. We needed to go into Shifa precisely because what I explained beforehand. The World Health Organization was saying it can't be done. You can't evacuate this hospital. And now here we are again at the story of Rafah, which, as you rightly pointed out, is one of the last strongholds of Hamas's operational capabilities, where just last week we rescued 2 hostages that were being held in Rafah. And we understand that there are more hostages being held in the Rafah area. And Hamas are there extensively. So the question is, again, when the world is saying it can't be done, our argument is we've proven time and time again that mass movement of people can be done. There are places in the Gaza Strip that can be utilized for evacuation of civilians to those locations. The spectrum of our operations, as we've conducted throughout the course of the war, whether it's mass evacuations from the north or limited neighborhood evacuations from the areas of Khan Yunis, or no evacuations in Rafah when we did a special forces operation, there's I would say, a broad capability of different types of models to get people out of harm's way. And every time we've mobilized people, it's to get them out of harm's way so that they are not in the war zone. And so I am a bit frustrated sometimes with these statements by many of the different organizations, UN organizations, sometimes governments, that are raising concern about evacuating Rafah or mobilizing people again that perhaps have gone through what they call displacement 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. And my question or my answer to that is, what is the alternative? That we stop fighting, that we let Hamas continue to control the Gaza Strip? That is not an option for Israel. Hamas can't be in control of the Gaza Strip when this war is over. They can't be trusted with the power of governance. When they have the power of governance, they utilize it to build tunnels, to build a huge arsenal of rockets, to build a terrorist army that comes into Israel to butcher, murder, massacre, rape, and abduct. When they have the power of government, as they've promised, they can intend on repeating the 7th of October. So there is no prescription of getting rid of Hamas, which I generally think most of the world recognize. But we need to be able to implement that. And there is only, I don't see any way on earth that we will wave a magic wand and Hamas will just disappear. I don't see them releasing hostages without a huge, immense pressure on them.
But I know there's a very real war going on in Israel, and I think for most Israelis, that is front of mind and the preoccupation. There's a real unity within Israel, and Jewish people around the world generally feel that strongly as well. But then, of course, there's the war that you're on the front line for, which is the narrative war, the media war, the war around public opinion, perception, empathy towards Israel, and this impossible dynamic that we find ourselves in. I'm curious, when you think about that, what is short-term, what is the long-term impact? How do things like the International Court of Justice play into it? How do things like the increasing critique from friendly governments play into it? Because I suppose what for us on who are consuming the media abroad, we want to understand is Israel going to resume the standing it had before October 7th, or is this a whole new reality that we're facing?
Without a doubt, it's a whole new reality. Israel before October 7th and Israel after October 7th are two different Israels. I think, as I said in my very brief opening about myself, there was one thing that I knew that I would be doing on every Saturday night. It was protesting the government. But when my wife said to me, Peter, they're coming for us too, I knew that I had to do something. So for sure, Israel is a very, very different Israel after that. I think the accountability of our leadership, from politicians to the military leadership, is front and center. I think to get there, though, we need to create a new security reality that makes sure that this can never happen again. We are very, and I say this with very much respect, we're very attentive to our allies and what they're saying to us. But that does not mean we're willing to sacrifice ourselves again. As I said, if anybody has that magic wand or a secret prescription to wave Hamas away and bring home the hostages, Israel, we don't want to sacrifice any more sons and daughters on the front lines. Around 250 soldiers have fallen on the battlegrounds, and another 300 or so on the 7th of October itself. We didn't want to be at war. We had no intention of being at war in 2023 or 2024. But Hamas brought this war on us, a war unprecedented in the history of Israel in the magnitude. And therefore, we are in a situation where society, I would say, has come together. And there's a very broad consensus within Israel that the change has to happen. What will the international prices that we pay be are very, very serious questions. But I think we are not in a position to accept the reality of Hamas or Hezbollah, for instance, on the northern border, to be in a position of power again to do what happened on the 7th of October. Nobody would accept that. None of those that are criticizing us in our actions or our operations or our capability to do that would accept that for their own reality in their neighborhood, even if it was just an increase or a peak in crime. We expect our authorities to deliver the fundamental of fundamentals, which is sanctity of life and security. And that is where we are today, even 4.5 months on. Israelis still don't feel safe. There are still around 80,000 people who are not living in their homes in the south of Israel that have been evacuated. And there are another 100,000 Israelis in the north of Israel that have been evacuated, displaced internally, and in order to keep them out of harm's way. So the reality is one where when we are communicating on one hand the necessity. So my job is to make very, very clear that that reality is an unacceptable reality for Israelis, where terrorists like Hamas in the world, if we let Hamas do this and get away with it and continue as if nothing happened, we are setting a very, very low standard for life in the world and empowering radicals to do as they wish without consequence, basically setting a new norm for terrorism. So that is, I think, is one very, very core message that we are conveying. And on the other hand, it is the deep, tragic human reality that the people of Gaza are facing today. I would not shy away from that. That is, when Hamas decided to go to war, they didn't ask the people of Gaza if they're interested in war. They took the people of Gaza to war, and they are holding them. They're holding 134 Israeli hostages, and they're holding the people of Gaza hostage as well. But the fundamental the fundamental idea of us not operating, not protecting the people of Israel because Hamas is hiding behind the people of Gaza is not an option. We will continue to operate. We will continue to operate within the laws of armed conflict, distinction between civilians and terrorists, between non-combatants and combatants, based on the military necessity, and proportionality. But it is a huge feat, and I would say, in modern warfare, in modern times, no military has faced the challenge that we face today. It's on our doorstep.
Peter, you mentioned the hundreds of thousands of evacuees and really internal displaced people who are not able to return to their homes, both down south and up north. And I know I've got family up north. I know that there have been rockets fired by Hezbollah. I know that the threat and what seems to be the intentionality as to what might happen up north seems to fluctuate. And I'm just curious, what is the current dynamic up north, and what is the I suppose likelihood of that evolving into a full-scale conflict, or things looking like they might be quiet for a little while longer?
So here's I just put another quick slide to illustrate what happened. So on the left, we see Hamas's actual invasion on the 7th of October. And on the right, we have, if a war begins in Israel, I will order Hezbollah soldiers to conquer the Galilee. And that is Hassan Nasrallah in 2012. He actually published a plan of action on El Manar, which is Hezbollah's television station, which detailed extensively their plan to conquer the Galilee. They have their special forces, which is the Radwan force, which is very similar to the Nukhba force. And over the course of the last 4.5 months, we have had extensive attacks, thousands of rockets fired at Israel, 7 infiltration attempts, drone attacks, anti-tank guided missile attacks, very extensively throughout the cross of the northern frontier. So, of course, this reality is a very, very tense, fragile reality. Israel is not aspiring for a war against Hezbollah at this time. Our position and our perspective on that border is primarily a defensive posture. As I said, we have 100,000 Israelis that have been evacuated from that area. But absolutely, if we identify intent to conduct attack against us, then we will preempt it. The current efforts are to try and push Hezbollah in accordance to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, which dictates that no Hezbollah operatives and weapons should be in the south of Lebanon. But I would say that we have to let diplomacy run its course, but the IDF needs to prepare for the worst. And we are indeed extensive forces on the northern border today, more than ever in the last 20 years, probably. And we are making the necessary preparations in order to take the war to Hezbollah if required. Of course, Hezbollah are probably 10 times stronger than Hamas. They have guided missile capabilities. They have heavy warhead rockets that carry a 200, 300, 400 kilo warhead which can do massive destruction. A rocket called the Burkan. They, with 200,000 rocket arsenal, they can reach every place in the state of Israel and bombard us extensively. So that is a reality that we can't accept, and I would say it's a reality that that reflects as well the type of scenario that we faced on the 7th of October. We do not want to be surprised again. We want to make sure that Hezbollah don't have that capability or intention. So we are projecting a lot of force, a lot of power, but still maintaining the defensive posture, both on the border with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, but also against the Houthis, which are disrupting maritime routes, supply chain throughout the world in their attacks against various ships traveling through the Suez Canal. And that for us is also another challenge that needs to be addressed.
Peter, I'm mindful of time. I want to ask a couple of just final questions. But firstly, there's a huge amount of concern within the Jewish community around the world and the broader world around the humanitarian crisis, and obviously the pain and suffering within Gaza. I think the logic behind that pain and suffering being the fault of Hamas is there, right? And we understand it, but it doesn't make the images or the pain any less difficult. And certainly from the perspective of the average person in the street, they perceive Israel to be inflicting that pain and suffering. How do we firstly reconcile that difficulty and for ourselves, and secondly, how do we explain that when we are put in the difficult position of having to both advocate for Israel while seeing these horrific images emerging out of Gaza?
It is a huge challenge and a huge feat, and anybody living outside of Israel trying to make heads and tails of it through what we are seeing on the images of them on the media and the reports that are coming out as a human being is going to find it very, very difficult. I think it's very important to understand that we would not be here if it were not for the 7th of October. And if we are to make sure that the 7th of October doesn't happen again, then action and not words is required. The actions that we are conducting, and there's been extensive professional papers written about it, whether the likes of Colonel John Spencer from the US military, or who is a professional in urban warfare. That is what he does. And when we look at the types of the understanding, I think maybe the objection stems from the lack of like-minded people like ourselves to accept war as an option. And sometimes, especially in our neighborhood, it's a real option, an option that wasn't the first option that we chose, but a result of an action that we cannot permit anymore. We can't reconcile the images of death and destruction of Gaza, of the people of Gaza. And each and every one of them, and I'm not ashamed to say it, is a individual tragedy. It's a family tragedy. It's a community tragedy for the people in Gaza, and a national tragedy for Palestinians individually and around the world, and decent people, because we don't want to see people die. The alternative, though, is that we allow Hamas to set a new norm for terrorism around the world. It won't be just an Israeli problem if we allow that to be the new standard. And I agree that most places around the world, in the West specifically, do not face the similar threats that Israel faces. When the US, Australia, the UK, France send troops, expeditionary troops around thousands of miles away from their homes to fight wars, to counter terrorist activities, it's not the same as terrorists coming into our bedrooms, abducting men, women, and children, butchering babies, raping young women. It's just not the same. So we try and people are judging us based on their life experience, and they're not sitting in our shoes for 1 second, but they're very quick to judge us on our actions. And I think that is when you're trying to convey that, I would say, first of all, convey empathy. The human suffering is real. It's real on both sides. And indeed, the magnitude of the destruction and death on the Palestinian side is huge. We can't belittle that. And I would not for 1 second belittle that as a human being, as a father, and as a neighbor of the people of Gaza. We need leadership. We need a prospect for peace. There is no prospect for peace with Hamas. And they've promised to do it again and again and again if they have given the opportunity. So we can't give them that opportunity.
Peter, thank you. That was a deeply human and vulnerable answer, and I truly appreciate that and respect it. I think if I were to try and really in some stark contrast to the pain and suffering that's happening in Gaza, if I were to try and look at what there is to be somewhat hopeful about, as you said, there is great unity within Israel. It seems that we are nearing the end of Hamas's reign. It seems that there's also great unity and emotional commitment from Jewish people around the world, and a renewed love and passion and commitment towards the state of Israel. So, as demonstrated, by the way, by record attendance tonight, some 280 people logging in to join our conversation. Peter, I'm going to hand over to Bren in a moment to wrap us up, but thank you so much for your openness, your kindness, your generosity of time and spirit, but also for your continued leadership and advocacy for our people and for the state of Israel. We're very blessed to have someone like you at our helm in the communications warfare. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alon. You know, during these conversations, I'd like to take some notes so I can sort of highlight some of the important parts, but I was so engrossed in what you were saying, Peter, that I completely forgot to take notes. But happily, Alon really, I felt, just then summed up the conversation and summed up your contribution to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people around the world so well. Thank you for your time tonight. You are an extraordinarily busy person, but you gave a full hour out of your day for the Australian Jewish community. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will have another conversation in a month's time. The details of that conversation will be coming to you soon. In the meantime, Peter, everyone else, thank you again and stay safe. Good night.
Shalom and good evening.